Get ready for an extraordinary tale that will change everything you thought you knew about one of America's most isolated communities. This is the true story of a veteran and his loyal companion who bought a simple mountain cabin only to discover that its old stone fireplace concealed evidence of a tragedy that an entire town had conspired to hide for over 60 years. What they uncovered would not only expose a dark chapter of American history, but would bring justice to families who never knew the truth about their missing loved ones. Before we begin this incredible journey of discovery and redemption, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another fascinating story of hidden truths coming to light. Now, let's step inside the cabin that held a secret no one was meant to find. The advertisement had appeared on an obscure real estate website that specialized in remote properties, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Jack Brennan had been scrolling through listings at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep again, when he found it. The photos were amateur, slightly blurred, showing a log cabin that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The description was minimal. Remote mountain cabin, Cascade Mountains, Oregon. 1-800-SQFT, built 1961. Stone fireplace needs work. Cash only, $47,000. Serious inquiries only. It was the phrase serious inquiries only that caught Jack's attention. In his experience, that usually meant the seller knew something that would scare away casual buyers. But Jack wasn't a casual buyer. He was a desperate man looking for a place where the sounds of civilization couldn't reach him, where unexpected visitors were impossible, where he could finally stop jumping at shadows and diving for cover at backfiring cars. The drive from Portland took him 4 hours on a wet September morning in 2023, the last 90 minutes on progressively deteriorating roads that wound through the Cascade Mountains like scars. His GPS had given up somewhere around mile marker 42, but the hand-drawn map the real estate agent had reluctantly provided after 3 phone calls proved accurate enough. The agent, a nervous woman named Beverly who clearly didn't want to make this sale but needed the commission, had warned him repeatedly about the isolation, the lack of amenities, the harsh winters. She didn't understand that everything she listed as a negative was exactly what Jack wanted. Beside him in the passenger seat of his battered Ford F-150, Max maintained a vigilant watch on the passing forest. The German Shepherd's training was evident in his posture, alert but calm, ready to respond but not anxious. Max had been Jack's constant companion for 2 years now, ever since the Veterans Administration had paired them as part of a service dog program for combat veterans with severe PTSD. The dog had been trained to detect the subtle physiological changes that preceded Jack's panic attacks, to provide grounding pressure therapy during flashbacks, to sweep rooms for potential threats in a way that looked casual to observers, but gave Jack the security assessment he needed to function. Jack had initially resisted the idea of a service dog. After 18 years in the Marines, including 6 combat deployments that had left him with a traumatic brain injury, chronic pain from shrapnel still embedded in his left shoulder, and nightmares that made sleep feel like another battlefield, he'd thought he could white-knuckle his way through civilian life. He'd been wrong. Spectacularly wrong. It had taken a complete breakdown in a grocery store, dropping to the floor when a cart crashed into a display, convinced he was under mortar fire, for him to accept he needed help. Max had been that help. The dog seemed to understand Jack's damage on an instinctive level, providing not just trained responses, but genuine companionship. In the 2 years they'd been together, Max had pulled Jack out of more flashbacks than he could count, had stood between him and perceived threats until Jack's brain could catch up to reality, had been the anchor that kept him from drifting completely into the darkness that lived in his head. The final turn revealed the cabin, and Jack felt something in his chest he hadn't experienced in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Hope. The structure sat in a clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western red cedars, their canopy so thick it created a perpetual twilight despite the morning hour. The cabin itself was built from logs that had weathered to silver gray, topped with a green metal roof thick with moss. It looked like it had grown from the mountain itself, organic and permanent. Ruth Henley was already there, standing on the covered porch that ran the length of the cabin's front. She was 93 years old according to the paperwork, but she stood straight, despite leaning on a walking stick that looked hand-carved from local wood. She wore practical clothes, Jeans, boots, a flannel shirt that suggested she'd made the difficult drive up here herself, despite her age. "Mr. Brennan," she called as he parked the truck. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd gotten lost. Most people do the first time. The second time too, if I'm being honest." Jack approached slowly, Max heeling perfectly at his side despite the explosion of new scents that must have been overwhelming to the dog's sensitive nose. Up close, Ruth's face was a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, assessing him with the same intensity he was assessing her. "Your map was good," Jack said, shaking her hand carefully. Her grip was surprisingly firm, the hand of someone who had worked hard all their life. "This place is exactly what I've been looking for." "Is it now?" Ruth studied him for a long moment, taking in the military posture he couldn't shake, the way his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, the perfect positioning that kept his back to the truck and gave him clear sightlines in all directions. "You're military." It wasn't a question. "Marines. 18 years. "Harold was Army," she said, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly. "My husband. He built this place. Korea, then Vietnam for a bit before they sent him home with pieces missing. Not the kind you could see, mind you, but missing all the same. This cabin was his answer to those missing pieces. Built it with his own hands in 1961, right after he got back." She turned to look at the cabin, and Jack saw her shoulders tense. "He died 5 years ago. Liver cancer, though I think he'd been dying since 1963. Just took his body that long to catch up with his spirit." She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "I should tell you, Mr. Brennan, this place has weight to it. Harold always said buildings absorb the history around them, soak it up like wood soaks up rain. This one's soaked up more than most." "Ma'am," Jack said carefully, "I've got enough weight of my own. Whatever this place has absorbed, I'm sure I can handle it." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, then at Max, who sat at perfect attention, despite his obvious interest in exploring. "Maybe you can at that. Come on, I'll show you inside." The front door was massive, made from a single slab of old-growth cedar, hung on hand-forged hinges that looked like they belonged in a medieval castle. It opened directly into the main room, and Jack's attention was immediately captured by the fireplace. It dominated the entire north wall, a massive structure of fitted stone that extended from floor to ceiling and was easily 8 feet wide. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each stone had been chosen and placed with an artist's eye, creating patterns that seemed random at first, but revealed subtle organization the longer you looked. "Harold spent 3 months on that fireplace alone," Ruth said, noticing his attention. "Gathered every stone himself from the creek bed about a mile down the mountain. Some days he'd only bring back 1 or 2, saying they weren't right, weren't what he was looking for. He was particular about it. Obsessive, really. He'd work on it at night sometimes. I'd come up here and find him placing and replacing the same stones, like he was trying to solve a puzzle only he could see." She moved closer to the fireplace, running her hand along the stones with surprising tenderness. "He said it had to be perfect, had to be solid enough to outlast everything else. 'This will be here when we're all dust,' he used to say. Sometimes I'd catch him just staring at it, not like he was looking at it, but through it, like he was seeing something else entirely, or remembering something." The rest of the cabin was simpler but well constructed. The kitchen occupied the southeast corner of the main room, with cabinets that Harold had clearly built himself. Solid wood construction with dovetail joints that spoke of patience and skill. A hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom that still had fixtures from the 1960s. The windows were positioned strategically, Jack noticed with his tactical eye, providing good sightlines while limiting exposure, allowing for cross-ventilation while maintaining defensive positions. "The roof leaks," Ruth said, her honesty refreshing. 3 places that I know of, probably more. The plumbing is temperamental on good days and vindictive on bad ones. The electrical system works, but probably violates every code written since 1965. The well is good, though. Never run dry in 60 years, not even in the drought of 88. And the septic was redone about 10 years ago when the old one finally gave up. She led him to each problem area, pointing out damage and needed repairs, with the thoroughness of someone who had been maintaining the property from a distance for too long. Water stains on the ceiling, gaps where the chinking between logs had fallen out, a bathroom floor that had a suspicious spring to it. But the bones were solid. The foundation was good and the logs themselves showed no signs of rot. Harold built things to last, Ruth said, ending the tour back in the main room. Even when he was falling apart himself, he built things that would endure. This place was his refuge, his sanctuary. He'd come up here when the memories got too bad, when the nightmares wouldn't let him sleep. Sometimes he'd stay for weeks, and I'd know not to follow, not to push. He'd come back when he could bear to be around people again. She moved to the window that looked out over the valley, her reflection ghostly in the old glass. I should tell you something, Mr. Brennan. This mountain, this whole area, it has history. Dark history. Cedar Falls wasn't always the quiet little town it is now. Back in the 60s there were tensions, conflicts. Things happened that people don't talk about even now. Harold was part of that history, though he never spoke of it directly. But I know it haunted him. It's why he built this place. Not to forget, but to find some way to live with remembering. Jack felt Max press against his leg, the dog sensing his handler's increasing tension. Mrs. Henley, what kind of things? Ruth turned from the window, and Jack saw tears in her eyes that she didn't try to hide. The kind of things that make men wake up screaming, the kind that make them drink themselves to death or eat a bullet. Harold did neither. He was too stubborn for that, but he carried something heavy until the day he died. And I think he left something here. Something he couldn't take with him but couldn't destroy either. She moved back to the fireplace, placing her hand on one particular stone about 3 feet from the floor on the right side. He was so particular about this section. Rebuilt it 3 times even though it looked perfect to me each time, said it wasn't right, wasn't what it needed to be. The night he finished it, finally satisfied, he sat here drinking whiskey and crying. Only time I ever saw Harold cry, and we were married for 57 years. Jack noticed that the stone she was touching was different from the others, smoother, as if polished by countless touches. Ruth saw him notice and pulled her hand back, as if burned. I'm selling this place for $47,000, Mr. Brennan. That's about a quarter of what it's worth, even with all the problems. I'm selling it because my children want nothing to do with it. They say it feels wrong, oppressive. I'm selling it because I'm 93 and can't maintain it anymore, but mostly I'm selling it because I think it needs someone like you. Someone who understands carrying weight, who knows what it's like to live with things that can't be unseen. She paused, then added quietly, someone who might be brave enough to do what Harold couldn't. They completed the paperwork at the only diner in Cedar Falls that stayed open past the tourist season. The Cedar Falls Cafe was a time capsule from the 1950s, with cracked vinyl booths, a Formica counter, and coffee that could strip paint. The locals stared openly at Jack and Max, their curiosity unabashed. Whispers followed them, speculation about who he was, why he wanted the Henley place, whether he knew about what happened. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Dolores, brought their coffee with a side of interrogation. You're the one buying Harold's cabin? Brave man. That place has been empty for 5 years, and even before Harold passed, he was the only one who could stand to be there for long. My husband helped him build it, back in '61. Said Harold was like a man possessed, working dawn to dusk, sometimes through the night. Said he was building it like he was building a fortress or a prison. Dolores, Ruth said sharply, Mr. Brennan doesn't need to hear old gossip. It's not gossip if it's true, Dolores shot back, but she retreated to the counter, though Jack could feel her watching them. After the papers were signed and Ruth had handed over the keys, a heavy ring with not just door keys, but keys to outbuildings Jack hadn't even seen yet. She paused before leaving. Mr. Brennan, I need to tell you one more thing. Harold kept journals. I found some after he died, destroyed them. They were difficult, but I think he might have hidden others. If you find them, if you find anything, please remember that Harold was a good man who did a bad thing. Or maybe a bad man who tried to do good. I never figured out which, and I lived with him for 57 years. She left then, and Jack watched her drive away in her old Subaru, handling the mountain roads with the confidence of long practice. The diner had gone quiet around him, everyone pretending not to stare while obviously staring. Max stayed pressed against his leg, alert to the tension in the room. You need anything else, hon? Dolores asked, appearing with the coffee pot. Just the check, Jack said. On the house, she said, which in Jack's experience meant she wanted something. You seem like a nice young man. That dog's beautiful. But that cabin's got history. Dark history. You sure you know what you're getting into? "I'm sure I need a quiet place to live," Jack replied, standing. Max immediately moved into heel position. "Sometimes quiet places are the loudest," Dolores said cryptically. "The dead don't always rest easy, especially when they didn't get justice." Jack left without responding, but her words followed him up the mountain road back to his new home. The first weeks were consumed with making the cabin livable. Jack worked methodically, systematically addressing each issue. He patched the roof first. 3 leaks had actually been 5, and he ended up replacing a significant section where water damage had compromised the decking. The plumbing required complete replacement in several sections. Pipes that had frozen and thawed for 60 years had developed splits that only revealed themselves under pressure. Max adapted quickly to their new home, establishing patrol routes around the property, identifying the local wildlife through scent markers, learning which sounds were normal forest noise and which deserved attention. The dog seemed particularly interested in the fireplace, often lying in front of it, even when no fire was burning, occasionally approaching the right side and sniffing intently at certain stones. Jack initially dismissed this as the dog detecting mice or other creatures that might have nested in small gaps. But as the days passed, Max's behavior became more focused, more insistent. He would paw at specific stones, whine at them, then look at Jack with the expression he used when he detected something important during their walks, the same look he'd had when he'd found a lost hiker the previous spring, or when he'd alerted Jack to an oncoming panic attack before Jack himself was aware of it. It was during the 3rd week, October now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rust, that Jack decided to investigate what Max was detecting. He'd finished the major repairs and was working on the fireplace anyway, cleaning years of soot and creosote build-up, checking the chimney for obstructions. The stonework was even more impressive up close. Each stone had been shaped to fit perfectly with its neighbors, creating a surface that was artistic, while being absolutely solid. Except for that one stone Ruth had touched, the one that seemed polished by years of contact. Jack examined it carefully. It was granite like the others, but smoother, and when he pressed on it experimentally he felt the slightest give. Not enough that the structure was compromised, but enough to suggest it wasn't mortared like the others. He worked at the edges with a thin knife blade, carefully clearing decades of accumulated dirt and debris. The stone was definitely separate from its neighbors, held in place by pressure and precise fitting rather than mortar. It took an hour of careful work, but finally the stone shifted, sliding inward about an inch before pivoting on some hidden mechanism. Behind it was a cavity, carefully constructed and lined with what looked like tin to protect against moisture. Inside were 2 packages wrapped in oilskin, brown with age but intact. Jack's pulse quickened. His military experience had taught him that hidden caches were rarely benign. People didn't go to this much trouble to hide happy memories or treasure maps. He photographed everything in place before carefully extracting the packages, Max whining anxiously beside him, sensing his handler's tension. He laid the packages on the kitchen table, taking his time unwrapping them. The first contained a leather journal, its pages yellowed but preserved by the oilskin and tin lining. The second, heavier package contained photographs and what looked like official documents. Jack started with the journal, opening to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind taught in schools before keyboards replaced penmanship. At the top of the page was written, "The Confession of Harold Matthew Henley, June 15th, 1963. May God forgive me, for I will never forgive myself." Jack began to read, and with each page his horror grew. According to Harold's journal, Cedar Falls in 1963 had been dying. The timber industry that had sustained it for generations was moving to areas with easier access and cheaper labor. Mills were closing, families were leaving, businesses were shuttering. The town's population had dropped from over 3,000 in 1950 to barely 900 by 1963. Those who remained were desperate, watching their entire way of life disappear. The proposed interstate highway project had seemed like salvation. The planned route would bring traffic directly through Cedar Falls, revitalizing the economy, bringing tourists and commerce. The state had approved the route, federal funding was secured, and construction was scheduled to begin in July 1963. Cedar Falls would be saved. But there was a problem, and that problem had a name: Camp Esperanza. Camp Esperanza was what the locals called the settlement of migrant workers that had grown up on the outskirts of town. It had started in 1960 as a temporary camp for seasonal workers, mostly Mexican and Filipino families who came for the apple harvest and what remained of the logging work. But as work became scarcer and travel more expensive, many families had stayed year-round, building more permanent structures, establishing a community. By 1963, Camp Esperanza housed about 60 people. They had built small houses from salvaged materials, created gardens, established a school where Maria Santos, a young teacher from Mexico City with a university education, taught the children. They had a chapel where Father Miguel Santos, no relation to Maria, held services. They had become a community, one that existed parallel to Cedar Falls, but separate from it. The camp sat directly in the path of the proposed highway. The state had offered to relocate the families, but the compensation was insulting. $50 per family, with no provision for replacement housing or assistance finding new work. The families had refused, and when the state tried to evict them, they had found an unexpected advocate in Roberto Vasquez, one of the workers who had educated himself in American law and understood their rights better than anyone expected. Vasquez had contacted lawyers from the American Civil Liberties Union. He had filed injunctions. He had organized the camp to resist what he correctly called illegal eviction. The case had made it to federal court, where a judge had issued a temporary restraining order preventing the state from removing the families until a fair compensation package could be negotiated. The highway project ground to a halt. The state gave Cedar Falls an ultimatum: resolve the situation by July 1st, or the highway route would be changed to bypass the town entirely. Cedar Falls would be left to die. Harold's journal entry for June 20, 1963, was written in a shaking hand. Town meeting tonight. Closed session, no minutes recorded. Mayor Christie laid it out plain. Either the camp goes, or we all go under. Sheriff Patterson said the law couldn't help us. The federal judge had tied their hands. That's when Tom Morrison stood up. Tom's usually a quiet man, runs the hardware store, never makes waves. But he stood up and said, sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes men have to do what men have to do. The room went silent. We all knew what he meant, we all knew what he was suggesting. And God help us, we all knew he was right. Or we told ourselves he was right. Christie asked for a show of hands of who was willing to do whatever was necessary to save the town. I watched my hand rise like it belonged to someone else. 43 hands raised. 43 men who became murderers in that moment, though we wouldn't pull the triggers for another 10 days. Jack had to stop reading. He walked outside, Max following closely, and vomited into the bushes. The dog pressed against him, providing the grounding pressure that helped prevent a full panic attack. Jack had seen death in combat, had killed in the line of duty, had witnessed atrocities. But this was different. This was premeditated murder of civilians, of families, of children, planned in a town meeting like they were discussing zoning ordinances. When he could continue, Jack returned to the journal. Harold's entries over the next 10 days documented the planning with horrifying detail. The conspirators had divided into groups, one to handle transportation, one to deal with the bodies, one to create the cover story, one to ensure the camp's men were away when it happened. Everything was organized with small-town efficiency, everyone playing their part in what they called the relocation. On June 30th, 1963, while most of the camp's men were at a logging site 20 miles away, kept there by their employer, who was part of the conspiracy, the plan was executed. Harold hadn't participated directly, claiming he needed to maintain an alibi by being visibly at his store all day, but he documented what he learned from those who were there. 40 armed men had surrounded the camp at 3 a.m. The remaining residents, mostly women, children, and elderly, were pulled from their beds. Some tried to resist and were beaten. Maria Santos tried to protect her students and was knocked unconscious. Father Miguel Santos attempted to intervene and was shot in the shoulder, then tied up. The residents were loaded into covered trucks, their possessions piled and burned, their homes immediately bulldozed. The official story, prepared in advance and disseminated through compliant local media, was that the families had accepted the improved relocation offer and had been transported to communities throughout Oregon and Washington where work was available. Documents were forged, bus tickets to various cities were purchased and destroyed to create a paper trail. The state, eager to see the highway project proceed, didn't investigate too closely. But the trucks hadn't gone to bus stations. They had driven into the mountains, to the abandoned Martindale quarry, which had been closed since a collapse in 1947 made it unworkable. There, according to what Harold learned from a drunk Tom Morrison weeks later, all 63 residents of Camp Esperanza had been murdered. The journal entry for July 15, 1963, was almost unreadable, the writing deteriorating as Harold's emotional state collapsed. Tom told me everything. They made them dig first, made them dig the pit. The children were crying. The women were praying. Father Santos was giving last rites even with a bullet in his shoulder. Then Sheriff Patterson gave the order. They used hunting rifles mostly. Some used pistols. Tom said it took less than a minute once it started. But that minute would last forever in his mind. The youngest was a baby, maybe 6 months. The mother was holding it when... I can't write it. I can't write what they did. But I know it. I know it, and I'm part of it because I raised my hand in that meeting. Because I stayed quiet. Because I'm staying quiet now. We're all staying quiet. The men who went there came back different. Sheriff Patterson started drinking heavy. 3 of them have already killed themselves. Officially accidents or heart attacks, but we all know better. The rest of us just pretend it didn't happen. But it happened. God knows it happened. Jack looked at the photographs next. They were black and white, taken with what must have been a small camera, maybe hidden. They showed the aftermath, the pit being filled with a bulldozer, the camp burning, personal effects being destroyed. One photo, slightly blurred but clear enough, showed bodies wrapped in sheets being lowered into the ground. Another showed a small shoe, a child's shoe, abandoned in the dirt. But it was the final set of photographs that broke Jack's composure completely. Someone, Harold didn't say who, had photographed the camp before the massacre. These showed the people who would die. Families sitting outside their small homes, children playing, Maria Santos teaching a class under a tree, Father Miguel Santos conducting a service. They were living their lives, unaware that their neighbors were planning their murder. Harold had apparently spent years after the massacre trying to atone without confessing. He had gathered evidence, including a recording of Tom Morrison's drunken confession on a small tape recorder. He had compiled lists of the victims' names, physical descriptions when he didn't know names, details about their lives that he'd learned through careful investigation. He'd even tracked down some of the men who had been at the logging camp, but they had either fled immediately or disappeared shortly after asking too many questions about their families. The journal's later entries showed Harold's deteriorating mental state. August 1st, 1963. Started building the cabin today. Need to get away from town, from the faces of the men I know are murderers, from my own face in the mirror. September 15th, 1963. The highway construction has begun. They're building it over the ashes of Camp Esperanza. Every time I drive on it, I'll be driving over their graves. December 25th, 1963. Christmas. Ruth doesn't understand why I can't celebrate. How can I celebrate the birth of Christ when I helped murder his children? Their faces are in every crowd, their voices in every child's laugh. June 30th, 1964. 1 year. Sheriff Patterson shot himself last night, left a note that just said, "I'm sorry." Tom Morrison is drinking himself to death. The others pretend everything is normal. The town is prospering from the highway. Blood money. All of it. October 12th, 1968. 5 years. I've tried to convince others to come forward. They all say the same thing. It's too late, it would destroy everything, our families would suffer. They're right. And they're wrong. Every day we don't confess is another day of injustice. January 1st, 1975. Ruth knows something is wrong. She hears me call their names in my sleep. Roberto Vasquez, Maria Santos, little Miguel Rodriguez, the baby whose name I never learned. I want to tell her, but it would destroy her to know what I am. December 15th, 1978. 15 years. I'm putting this evidence in the fireplace I built. The fireplace I spent 3 months on because I had to get it right, had to make sure it would last, would keep these secrets until someone braver than me could reveal them. I'm a coward. I've been a coward for 15 years, but maybe someday someone will find this and do what I cannot. There were no entries after 1978, but there was one additional document, dated 2018, written in a shakier hand. I am dying. Cancer, the doctors say, but I know better. It's the weight of 63 souls. I should confess, I should tell the truth. But I am still a coward. I've been a coward for 55 years. This evidence is my only attempt at courage. Preserving the truth, I lack the strength to speak. If you're reading this, you're braver than I was. The quarry is 3 miles northeast of town, off the old logging road that branches from Highway 20 at mile marker 15. They deserve justice. Their families deserve the truth. God forgive me for not giving it to them myself. Jack sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, reading and rereading, examining each photograph, absorbing the full horror of what had happened. Max stayed beside him, occasionally whining, sensing his handler's distress but unable to provide comfort for this kind of wound. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene given what Jack now knew, he made his decision. These families deserved justice, even 60 years late. The truth needed to be told, regardless of the consequences. But Jack was also a tactician. He knew that going directly to local authorities would be a mistake. How many people in Cedar Falls were descendants of the conspirators? How many still had power, influence, the ability to make evidence disappear? He needed allies, needed to build an unassailable case before revealing what he'd found. His first call was to Maria Santos, not the murdered teacher, but an investigative journalist with the Oregonian who shared the name. Maria had made her reputation exposing corruption in small Oregon towns, revealing decades-old conspiracies that local authorities had covered up. She had the skills, the platform, and most importantly, the courage to handle something of this magnitude. "Ms. Santos," Jack said when she answered, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "My name is Jack Brennan. I'm a Marine veteran living near Cedar Falls, Oregon. I've discovered evidence of a mass murder that occurred in 1963. 63 people, including children. I have photographs, documentation, and a detailed confession from one of the conspirators." There was a long silence. "Mr. Brennan, that's a serious claim. What makes you think—" "I'm sending you a photograph right now," Jack interrupted, using his phone to send one of the clearer images. "That's a mass grave being filled in Cedar Falls, 1963. I have dozens more, plus written documentation. This is real, and it's massive." He heard her sharp intake of breath when the image arrived. "Jesus Christ, where did you find this?" "Hidden in my cabin. The previous owner was part of the conspiracy. He hid the evidence but never had the courage to reveal it. Miss Santos, I need your help. This entire town was complicit in mass murder. Some of the perpetrators might still be alive. Their descendants certainly are, and some of them have power. If I go to the local authorities, this evidence might disappear, and I might disappear with it." "I'll be there in 6 hours," Maria said immediately. "Don't talk to anyone else. Don't go anywhere. And Mr. Brennan, make copies of everything. Hide them in different places. If this is real, and that photo suggests it is, then you're holding evidence of one of the worst hate crimes in Oregon history. People have killed to keep secrets like this." While he waited for Maria, Jack made copies of everything using a scanner he'd bought for his military paperwork. He uploaded the files to multiple cloud services, emailed copies to himself at different addresses, even mailed physical copies to his sister in Florida, with instructions not to open them unless something happened to him. Max picked up on his urgency, pacing the cabin, alternating between watching Jack work and monitoring the windows for threats. It was during this frantic documentation that Jack found something he'd initially missed, a small key taped to the back of the journal. It was a safety deposit box key from a bank in Portland with a number etched into it. Harold had hidden additional evidence somewhere else, a backup in case the Fireplace cache was discovered. Maria Santos arrived just after 2 p.m., having driven straight through from Portland. She was younger than Jack had expected, maybe 35, with intense dark eyes that reminded him of intelligence officers he'd known, people who could process large amounts of information quickly and see patterns others missed. She wasn't alone. She'd brought a photographer named David Chen and a research assistant named Jennifer Walsh. "I hope you don't mind the backup," Maria said, "but if this is what you say it is, we need to document everything properly from the start." For the next 4 hours, they methodically went through every piece of evidence. David photographed each page, each image, using professional equipment that would stand up in court. Jennifer began cross-referencing the names Harold had documented with historical records, using her laptop and satellite internet to access databases. Maria interviewed Jack on camera, having him walk through his discovery step by step. "This is authentic," Maria said finally, her voice shaky. "The paper, the ink, the photographic stock. It's all period correct. And these names, Jennifer's already found immigration records for 12 of them. They existed. They were here. And then they vanished in July 1963. There's more," Jack said, showing them the key. "Harold hid additional evidence somewhere. This looks like a safety deposit box key." Maria examined it carefully. Pacific Northwest Bank. They were absorbed by Wells Fargo in the 1980s, but they should still have records. "We'll need a court order to open it, but with this evidence we can get one." As the sun set, casting long shadows through the cabin, Maria laid out their strategy. "We need to move carefully, but quickly. First, we verify everything we can independently. Then we find descendants of the victims. They deserve to know before this becomes public. We'll need protection for you, Mr. Brennan. Once this story breaks, you'll be a target." "I can take care of myself," Jack said, his hand unconsciously moving to where his sidearm would have been in combat. "Not against an entire town," Maria replied. "Some of these people's descendants are powerful. The Morrison family owns half the businesses in Cedar Falls. The Christie family has produced 2 state senators and a federal judge. They won't let this come out without a fight." She was right, of course. That night, after Maria and her team had returned to Portland with copies of everything, Jack slept fitfully, Max on high alert beside his bed. Every sound in the forest became a potential threat, every shadow a possible intruder. The cabin that had been his sanctuary now felt exposed, vulnerable. The next morning brought the first sign that word had gotten out. When Jack drove to town for supplies, the reception was different. Conversations stopped when he entered the general store. People stared openly, hostilely. Dolores at the diner refused to serve him, simply pointing to a newly posted sign that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." On his truck windshield, he found a note. "Some things are better left buried, for everyone's sake." Jack returned to the cabin to find the front door ajar, though he was certain he'd locked it. Nothing was missing, but things had been moved, searched. Someone had been looking for something. The fireplace hiding spot was undisturbed. They hadn't found it, but they knew he had something. That evening, Maria called with news. "We found Roberto Vasquez's family. His daughter Elena is still alive, living in Los Angeles. She's 73. Her mother spent her whole life wondering what happened to Roberto. She never remarried, never gave up hope he'd come back." "Does Elena know?" Jack asked. "I told her we had information about her father. She's flying up tomorrow. Jack, she has DNA from her father, a lock of hair her mother kept. If we can match it to remains in that quarry, it would prove everything," Jack finished. "But getting to the quarry would require official involvement, and that meant trusting someone in authority." Maria had a contact in the FBI's Civil Rights Division, someone who specialized in cold cases involving racial violence. Agent Sarah Mitchell agreed to meet them in Portland, away from Cedar Falls' influence. Agent Mitchell was a small, intense woman who listened to their presentation without interrupting, her expression growing grimmer with each piece of evidence. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This is one of the worst cases of mass murder I've seen," she said finally. "And the cover-up, an entire town complicit for 60 years. We'll need to move fast once we start. Can you get me to the quarry without local law enforcement knowing?" Jack could. His military training in reconnaissance would finally serve a purpose in civilian life. That night, using night vision equipment he'd kept from his service, Jack led Agent Mitchell and her team to the quarry. It was exactly where Harold's journal had indicated, overgrown now, filled with 60 years of vegetation. But ground-penetrating radar revealed what the forest had hidden, a mass grave, exactly where Harold had said it would be. The excavation began at dawn, November 1st, 2023. By then, Maria's story was ready to break, waiting only for confirmation of the bodies. The FBI had quietly taken over jurisdiction from local authorities, who were told only that they were investigating a cold case from the 1960s. Jack stood at the edge of the quarry with Max, watching as the careful excavation proceeded. Elena Vasquez stood beside him, her face a mask of controlled emotion. She had brought photographs of her father, a young man smiling at the camera, unaware of his fate. "My mother always said he wouldn't abandon us," Elena said quietly. "She said he loved us too much. Everyone told her she was foolish, that men leave all the time. But she knew. Somehow she knew. The first bones appeared just after noon. Then more, and more. The forensic team worked in horrified silence as the magnitude of the crime became apparent. 63 people, exactly as Harold had documented: men, women, children. Some showed signs of violence, skulls fractured by blunt force trauma, bones broken by bullets. They had not died easily or quickly. The story broke that evening, November 1st, 2023. Maria's report led every newscast in the country. The photographs Harold had preserved, the journal entries, the mass grave. It was undeniable, overwhelming, devastating. Cedar Falls was descended on by media from around the world, all wanting to understand how an entire town could conspire to commit and then cover up mass murder. The town's reaction was swift and divided. Some residents, mostly younger ones with no direct connection to the crime, expressed horror and demanded answers. But others, particularly older residents and descendants of the conspirators, denied everything, claimed the evidence was fabricated, accused Jack of creating an elaborate hoax. The denials became harder to maintain as more evidence emerged. The safety deposit box, when finally opened, contained additional documentation, financial records showing how the conspirators had profited from the highway development, correspondence discussing the cover-up, even photographs of some conspirators that Harold had secretly taken at town gatherings, documenting who had blood on their hands. 3 of the conspirators were still alive, all in their late 90s: Thomas Christie, the former mayor's son, James Patterson, the sheriff's nephew, and surprisingly, Margaret Morrison, Tom Morrison's widow, who had known about the massacre and helped create the cover story about the families being relocated. Their arrests made national news. The image of FBI agents leading 97-year-old Thomas Christie away in handcuffs while he shouted about protecting our town from invaders became iconic, a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. The trials that followed were complex, both legally and emotionally. The defense argued that the defendants were too old, too frail, that too much time had passed. But the prosecution had Harold's evidence, the physical proof from the grave, and most damningly, Margaret Morrison's decision to testify for the prosecution in exchange for a plea deal. Margaret's testimony was devastating. She confirmed every detail in Harold's journal and added more. She named names, identified who had pulled triggers and who had covered up, who had burned the camp, and who had forged the documents. She showed no remorse, saying repeatedly that they had done what was necessary to save their town, but her cold recitation of facts sealed the fate of her co-defendants. If you're as moved by this discovery as we are, please take a moment to like this video and share it so more people learn about this buried chapter of American history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what happened next in Cedar Falls would shake the foundations of justice in America. The impact on Cedar Falls was catastrophic. Businesses closed as tourists stopped coming. Property values plummeted as residents fled the shame of their town's history. Within 6 months, the population had dropped by 70%. The town that had murdered to survive was dying from the revelation of that murder, but in that death came unexpected rebirth. The descendants of the victims, with support from civil rights organizations, began purchasing the abandoned property. They established a memorial at the site of Camp Esperanza, rebuilt some of the structures based on archaeological evidence and survivor memories, created an education center that would teach future generations about the dangers of hatred and the importance of justice. Jack found himself at the center of this transformation. The cabin that had hidden the truth became a pilgrimage site, with families of victims coming to see where Harold had preserved the evidence, where Jack had discovered it. Max, patient as always, became a therapy dog for grieving families, his calm presence helping them process emotions that had been suppressed for generations. Elena Vasquez made multiple trips to Cedar Falls, working with the memorial committee. She and Jack developed a friendship born of shared purpose. "You gave me my father back," she told him one evening as they stood at the memorial wall where Roberto Vasquez's name was now engraved. "Not alive, but with dignity. My mother died not knowing, but I know. That matters." The federal investigation expanded, revealing that Cedar Falls was not unique. Similar incidents had occurred throughout the West during the same period, covered up by communities that valued their economic survival over human lives. Jack's discovery had opened a door that couldn't be closed, leading to investigations in 7 other states. Ruth Henley, Harold's widow, was perhaps the most tragic figure in the aftermath. She had genuinely not known about the massacre, until Harold's drunken confession in 1978, and she had been living with that knowledge, unable to act on it, for 45 years. She testified at the trials, her dignity and grief moving even hardened reporters to tears. "I loved Harold for 57 years, she said from the witness stand. "I bore his children, built a life with him, held him when the nightmares came, and all that time he was carrying this terrible secret. When he finally told me, I wanted to go to the police, but he said they'd kill us both, that too many powerful people were involved. So I became complicit too, through my silence. I've lived with that shame for 45 years. At least now, in my final years, I can speak the truth." Ruth died 3 months after the trials ended, as if she had been holding on just long enough to testify. She left the cabin to Jack in her will, along with a letter. "This place needs someone who understands the weight of truth. You've carried that weight with honor. Take care of it, and of yourself." Jack continued living in the cabin, though it was no longer the isolated retreat he'd originally sought. He became the unofficial historian of the massacre, maintaining the archives, giving tours to researchers and family members, ensuring the story was preserved accurately. Max adapted to their new role, greeting visitors with calm dignity, sensing who needed comfort and who needed space. One visitor stood out among the many. Miguel Rodriguez had been 6 years old when he was murdered, and his younger sister Carmen, who had been at a relative's house that night and survived, came to Cedar Falls on the anniversary of the massacre. She was 67 now, having lived her entire life, wondering what had happened to her family. "I was supposed to be there," she told Jack, standing in the rebuilt chapel where her brother had prayed. "I had a fever, so they sent me to my aunt's house in Portland. When I came back, everyone was gone. The authorities told my aunt they'd been deported, but we knew Miguel was a citizen, born right here in Oregon. We never believed it, but what could we do? We were poor, Mexican, powerless." Jack showed her Harold's photos of the camp before the massacre. There was Miguel playing with other children, his smile bright and innocent. Carmen wept, holding the photo, seeing her brother for the first time in 60 years. "He loved marbles," she said. "Had a little bag of them he carried everywhere. I wonder if they're still there in that quarry." They were. The forensic team, doing additional excavation, found a small cloth bag of marbles near Miguel's remains. They were returned to Carmen, who held them like the treasures they were, the only physical connection to a brother stolen by hatred. The memorial grew over the years. A museum was built, housing Harold's journal and photographs, the evidence that had been hidden in the fireplace. The rebuilt Camp Esperanza became an education center, hosting school groups who learned about the massacre, but also about the lives that had been lived there, the hopes, dreams, and humanity of the victims. Jack often gave tours with Max, and later, after Max passed, with a new service dog named Scout at his side. He would stand in front of the fireplace that had hidden the truth and tell the story of Harold Henley, a man who had participated in evil but preserved evidence of it, whose cowardice in life had enabled courage in death. Harold Henley was both victim and perpetrator, Jack would tell visitors. He was trapped by the social pressure of his community, but he made a choice to participate in murder. He spent the rest of his life tortured by that choice, but he never found the courage to confess. The evidence he preserved was his only attempt at redemption. It's not enough. Nothing could be enough, but it ensured that the victims would eventually receive justice. The legal aftermath continued for years. Lawsuits were filed against the city, the state, and the federal government for their roles in enabling and covering up the massacre. Settlements were reached, with funds going to descendants of victims and to the Memorial Foundation. Several prominent families saw their fortunes and reputations destroyed as their ancestors' roles in the massacre were revealed. But there was resistance too. Death threats came regularly to Jack, to Maria Santos, to anyone prominently associated with revealing the truth. A group calling itself the Cedar Falls Patriots insisted the massacre never happened, that the evidence was fabricated, that it was all a plot to destroy white American heritage. They held rallies, created websites, published books, denying the massacre despite overwhelming evidence. Jack faced them with the steady calm he'd learned in combat. When they protested at the memorial, he stood silent guard with other veterans who had come to support him. When they threatened violence, he worked with law enforcement to ensure security. When they tried to discredit him personally, digging into his military record and mental health struggles, he faced it head-on. "Yes, I have PTSD," he said at a press conference after particularly vicious attacks on his character. "Yes, I've struggled with mental health, but that doesn't change the truth of what I found. 63 people were murdered. The evidence is overwhelming. My mental health challenges don't erase their deaths or excuse their murderers." The support from the veteran community was overwhelming. A group called Veterans for Truth established a permanent presence at the memorial, ensuring it was never vandalized, never attacked. They came from across the country, men and women who understood that serving your country sometimes meant revealing its darkest truths. 5 years after the discovery, Cedar Falls was essentially a ghost town. The few remaining residents were mostly elderly, unable or unwilling to leave. The businesses that had once lined Main Street were empty, their windows dark. The highway that had been built over Camp Esperanza still carried traffic, but no one stopped in Cedar Falls anymore. But at the memorial there was life. The descendants of victims had established a community garden on the site of the original camp gardens. The rebuilt school hosted classes for migrant worker children, continuing Maria Santos's educational mission 60 years after her death. The chapel held regular services, conducted in Spanish and English, celebrating the lives that had been lost and the justice that had finally been found. Jack, now 53, had found an unexpected peace in his role as guardian of this history. The isolation he'd sought had been replaced by purpose. The PTSD hadn't disappeared, but it had become manageable, the nightmares less frequent, the panic attacks rare. Max had lived to the remarkable age of 14 before passing peacefully in his sleep. Scout, his successor, was young and eager, trained not just as a service dog, but as a comfort dog for the many grieving visitors to the memorial. One autumn evening, 6 years after the discovery, Jack sat on the cabin's porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Scout lay beside him, alert but relaxed. The forest was quiet, except for the normal sounds of evening. Birds settling for the night, wind through the trees, the distant call of an elk. Maria Santos had won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the massacre and had written a book about it that became required reading in many schools. She still visited regularly, working on a follow-up about the long-term impact of revealing historical atrocities. "Do you regret it?" she asked Jack during one visit. "Finding the evidence, revealing it. Your life would have been simpler if you just plastered over that fireplace." Jack thought about the question, his hand finding Scout's head, drawing comfort from the dog's presence. "I came here looking for peace, for escape from the violence I'd witnessed. Instead, I found evidence of worse violence, hidden violence, violence that had been covered up for 60 years. But in revealing it, I found something I didn't know I was looking for: purpose. Those 63 people deserved justice. Their families deserved truth. If I'd hidden that evidence again, I'd have been no better than Harold, than all the people who knew and stayed silent." Maria nodded. "Harold's journal has become one of the most studied documents in American civil rights history. The way he documented his guilt, his failed attempts at courage, his preservation of evidence he couldn't reveal. It's a masterclass in the psychology of complicity." "He was a coward," Jack said simply, "but a coward who ensured the truth would survive. I don't forgive him. That's not my place. But I understand him. He was trapped between his conscience and his community, and he chose his community. But he also chose to preserve the evidence, to make sure someone could make a different choice later." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Jack thought about the strange path that had brought him here. A damaged veteran seeking isolation had become the revealer of one of America's worst hate crimes. A cabin meant to be a refuge had held evidence that changed history. A fireplace built by a guilty man to hide truth had ultimately revealed it. The memorial received thousands of visitors each year now, school groups, researchers, families of victims, and others drawn by the story of a town that had chosen murder over economic loss, silence over justice. They came to learn, to grieve, to understand how ordinary people could commit extraordinary evil. Jack welcomed them all, sharing Harold's journal, explaining the construction of the fireplace hiding place, walking them through his discovery. He had become an unexpected educator, teaching about the dangers of communal complicity, the importance of individual conscience, the way secrets poisoned communities across generations. The impact had spread far beyond Cedar Falls. The revelation had sparked a national examination of similar incidents, leading to the discovery of mass graves in 5 other states. The Cedar Falls precedent had established legal frameworks for prosecuting historical hate crimes. Universities established research programs dedicated to uncovering and documenting hidden racial violence. But for Jack, the most meaningful impact was personal. The families of the 63 victims had formed an association, and he had become close to many of them. They gathered each year on June 30th, the anniversary of the massacre, not just to mourn, but to celebrate the lives that had been lived, the community that had existed, the dignity that had been restored. Elena Vasquez, Roberto's daughter, had become particularly close to Jack. She often said he had given her father back to her, had proved her mother's faith had been justified. She brought her grandchildren to the memorial, teaching them about their heritage, about the great-grandfather they never met but could now be proud of. "He stood up for our rights," she would tell them. "He knew it was dangerous, but he stood up anyway. That's our legacy, not how he died, but how he lived." The cabin itself had become a historical landmark, preserved as it had been when Jack found the evidence. Visitors could see the fireplace, the carefully fitted stones, the hiding place that had preserved truth for 60 years. They could understand how Harold had built his guilt into the very structure of his refuge, creating a confession in stone and mortar. Ruth Henley was buried in the cemetery at the memorial, her grave marking her as a keeper of difficult truths. It was a kind epitaph for a woman who had lived with terrible knowledge for half her life, unable to act on it, but unable to forget it. As the years passed, the last of the conspirators died, taking their direct memories of that night to their graves. But their legacy lived on in the memorial, in the education center, in the ongoing fight for justice for other hidden crimes. Cedar Falls had become a symbol of both the worst and best of America, its capacity for horrific racial violence and its ability to eventually confront and acknowledge that violence. Jack, now in his late 50s, continued his work at the memorial. Scout had been joined by a younger dog, Hope, who was learning the routines of greeting visitors, providing comfort, being present for difficult emotions. Jack's PTSD had never fully disappeared, but it had transformed from a disability into a part of who he was, something that gave him insight into trauma and recovery, that helped him connect with grieving families. The fireplace still stood, solid as Harold had built it, a monument to the complex nature of conscience. Every stone had been placed by a man who had participated in mass murder, fitted carefully by hands stained with blood. Yet those same hands had created a hiding place for truth, had ensured that evidence survived, even as the perpetrator lacked the courage to reveal it. Standing before it one evening, Jack reflected on the nature of redemption. Harold had never achieved it. He had died with his secret intact, his cowardice unbroken, but he had made redemption possible for others, had preserved the tools for justice even if he couldn't wield them himself. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called, beginning its nighttime hunt. Scout and Hope lay at Jack's feet, content in their work, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. The cabin was quiet, peaceful even, despite the weight of history it carried. Jack thought about the 63 people buried in the quarry, now properly memorialized, their names remembered, their stories told. He thought about Harold Henley, tormented by guilt, building this fireplace as both refugee and confession. He thought about himself, a broken veteran who had stumbled into purpose, who had found healing in revealing truth. The work wasn't finished. There were still hidden graves to find, still families searching for answers, still communities harboring dark secrets. But progress had been made. Truth had defeated silence, justice had overcome complicity, courage had conquered fear, even if it had taken 60 years. As darkness fell, Jack went inside, the dogs following. He built a fire in the fireplace that had started everything, watching the flames dance over stones that had hidden such terrible secrets. The fire warmed the cabin, pushed back the mountain cold, created a circle of light in the darkness. This was his life now, guardian of difficult history, keeper of painful truth, educator about the dangers of silence. It wasn't the life he had planned when he bought this cabin, seeking only isolation and peace, but it was a life with meaning, with purpose, with the kind of honor that came from doing the right thing, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The fire crackled and sparked, casting shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest was dark and full of its own secrets, but inside, In the light and warmth, there was truth. And truth, Jack had learned, was its own form of peace, difficult and painful, but ultimately necessary for any real healing. The dogs slept, trusting their human to keep watch. Jack sat in his chair, Harold's journal on the table beside him, a constant reminder of how thin the line was between heroism and cowardice, between justice and complicity. He had crossed that line in the right direction, had chosen revelation over concealment, truth over comfort. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more questions, more opportunities to educate about the massacre and its aftermath. There would be tears, anger, sometimes denial, but there would also be understanding, reconciliation, and occasionally something approaching peace. The work would continue as it must, as it always had, one truth at a time, one revelation at a time, one act of courage building on another. The cabin stood strong in the darkness, its logs weathered but solid, its stone fireplace eternal as Harold had intended. It had sheltered a guilty man's secret for 60 years, and now it sheltered the truth that secret had become. It was a monument to the complexity of human nature, our capacity for evil and good, for cowardice and courage, for hiding truth and ultimately, inevitably, revealing it. This incredible true story reminds us that the most profound discoveries often come when we're looking for something else entirely, that houses and buildings can hold more than just memories, and that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep it's buried. If this story moved you, please share it with others who need to know about these dark chapters of our history and the courage it takes to bring them to light. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell to join us for more amazing stories of discovery and justice. Remember, sometimes the most important truths are hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone with the courage to look behind the stones. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of America's most shocking discoveries, proof that conscience can survive even the darkest secrets, and that justice, though delayed, will ultimately prevail.